Please stay until morning." The words left her lips like a prayer torn from a breaking heart, trembling in the doorway of a cabin battered by wind and old sorrow. The storm behind her clawed at the shutters, rattling the life she fought so hard to hold together. And the man on her porch coat soaked, eyes shadowed with danger froze, as if he'd been struck. Everyone in the valley whispered she should fear him, but tonight she feared the darkness outside far more. Lightning split the sky, revealing fresh hoof prints circling her land, and the stranger's jaw tightened, as though he recognized the threat before she did. He stepped inside, slow and deliberate, rain falling off his hat brim. "Ma'am, whoever's out there ain't ridden for mercy." Her breath caught, her world tilted, and the fire between them, the one she didn't ask for, didn't dare want, flared to life in that single, dangerous moment. The ridge was quiet in the pale morning light, the kind of quiet that felt earned only through loss. The widow knelt beside the rough wooden cross, her fingers pressed into the cold earth as if the soil itself might offer answers. The wind tugged gently at the strands of hair escaping her bonnet, lifting them like threads of grief carried across the open prairie. She breathed in slow, steadying herself against the truth she was still trying to accept. The grave was fresh, the dirt dark and unsettled. Her hands were dirty from smoothing it, shaping it, doing anything except letting it look abandoned. Beneath her fingernails clung the last bit of work she could do for the man she'd buried, ashes from a life that ended too soon. She whispered his name once, barely a sound, afraid the land might echo it back. By mid-morning, the sky had shifted to a muted gray. She gathered the small shovel, her movements mechanical, each one heavier than the last. A ridge hawk circled overhead, watching her with the kind of stillness only wild things knew. She wondered if it sensed her heart unraveling, or if it simply waited for the day to change. As she rose, a prickle ran along her spine. She turned slowly. At the edge of the tree line, where the shadows thickened, a figure on horseback lingered without moving. Not close enough to speak, not far enough to ignore. Her breath snagged in her chest, caught between fear and the certainty that danger rarely announced itself outright. For a moment, neither of them moved. The stranger sat tall in the saddle, hat brim low, posture too controlled to belong to a casual rider passing by. She could not see his face, only the stillness that made the cold morning feel colder. A part of her wanted to call out, to demand his purpose. Another part, the wiser part, stayed silent. The wind shifted. Leaves rustled in the trees, and the stranger's horse stamped once, restless. Without warning, he tugged the reins and disappeared deeper into the pines. No farewell, no explanation, simply gone, as if he had never been there at all. The widow stood frozen, her heart thudding too hard for a man who'd done nothing but look. By afternoon, she made her way down the narrow trail leading home. The path felt longer than usual, the quiet unnerving. Every snapped twig under her boots made her glance back, half expecting the rider to return. She told herself it was just nerves, just grief, just the strangeness of a world without her husband in it. But she knew better. The land did not lie, and eyes had been watching her. Her cabin came into view through the brush, small, weathered, and lonely. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, where she'd left the fire smoldering before the burial. She paused at the gate, letting her hand rest against the splintered wood. This had once been the place she felt safest. Now it felt like a question she didn't know how to answer. Inside, she hung her shawl and lit a lantern. The flame flickered in the dim room, revealing the simple life she'd tried to build. The iron stove, the single rocking chair, the table scarred by years of use. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. Loss had a way of changing the shape of rooms, even when the walls stayed still. She placed the shovel near the door and sat quietly, fingers resting on her lap. Her nails were still lined with dirt, the last physical trace of the man she'd loved, the man the town claimed died in an accident. But the widow had seen the bruises on his ribs, the way his coat was torn, the strange tension in the sheriff's face when he delivered the news. Accidents didn't leave secrets behind. The wind deepened outside, drifting across the fields in long sighs. She thought about the rider again, about the stillness in his shoulders, and the watchful quiet he carried like a second shadow. Something in him had felt too familiar to ignore, though she couldn't say why. Her husband had mentioned no one. He'd left her no warning, only questions. By dusk, the lantern light softened and stretched across the small room. She moved to the window, her palm pressing gently against the glass. The ridge where she'd buried her husband sat in the fading glow, distant but sharp in her memory. She felt as though something had shifted today, not the grief, but the world around it, as if the land itself braced for what might come next. The first star rose above the horizon when she finally whispered to the empty room, "I don't know how to do this alone." Her voice was soft, vulnerable, a truth pulled straight from the ache in her chest. The only answer was the steady moan of wind through the eaves, a sound that made the cabin feel too small for everything she carried inside. Night settled in slow layers. She lit another candle, though she wasn't sure why, perhaps to keep the darkness from feeling too absolute. As the flames steadied, she noticed something on the wooden floorboards near the door. A faint, muddy footprint, fresh, not hers. Her pulse jumped. She stepped back instinctively, breath held tight in her throat. She looked around, listening for any shift in the old walls, any creak that didn't belong to the house she knew so well. But silence met her, thick and waiting. The footprint pointed inward. Someone had stood just inside her door. A tremor passed through her, small but undeniable. She drew closer, studying the print, the size, the tread, the shape. It wasn't a boot from the town. It wasn't her husband's. The stranger on the ridge had been closer than she realized. Outside, the wind scraped across the cabin like a warning. She blew out the lantern, leaving only the faint glow of the hearth. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, and she stood still, letting her eyes adjust, letting her breath settle. The land could be cruel, but it could also tell truths if one listened carefully. And tonight, it seemed to whisper one thing. She was no longer alone in her grief, or in her danger. The fire cracked softly, sending a thin line of warmth across the floorboards. She stepped back toward her chair, slow and quiet, her gaze fixed on the door as though it might shift again. Her hands trembled only once before she steadied them against the wooden armrest. By the time she finally sat, her heartbeat had slowed, but the knot in her chest had not. She looked at the imprint again, the shape of a stranger's presence already fading into the wood. She felt a strange mix of fear and something she couldn't yet name, something that nudged at her heart like the first hint of a story she wasn't ready to tell. The night deepened, quiet and heavy. She let her eyes fall closed for a moment, knowing sleep wouldn't come. Not easily, not yet. The memory of the man on the ridge hovered in her thoughts, the way he disappeared without a word. And in that stillness, one truth lingered in the air. Someone had been close enough to touch her world, and close enough to return. By morning, the frost clung to the cabin windows in thin white veins, delicate as the quiet breath she drew to steady herself. The memory of the lone footprint near her door tightened her chest, though she tried to tell herself it had only been the storm, only her imagination, only grief distorting the shape of shadows. But she knew better. The land rarely lied, and fear rarely invented details as clear as tread marks in soft dirt. She stepped outside, pulling her shawl close around her shoulders. The air bit at her cheeks, crisp and sharp, carrying the clean scent of winter settling deeper into the valley. She followed the frozen path toward the gate, her boots crunching softly beneath her. It wasn't until she reached the fence line that she saw it, another set of prints, larger than the first, leading straight toward her land. The tracks stopped at the gate, the gate that now hung slightly ajar. Her breath trembled. She always shut it tight. Habit, safety, the simple order of a life she'd maintained even in the weeks of mourning. But someone else's hand had moved the latch. Someone strong enough to shift the old hinges with quiet ease, careful enough to leave no other trace. She scanned the tree line beyond her field, the morning light settling between branches like thin gold ribbons. Nothing stirred. No rider waited. No stranger watched from the shadows as before. Yet she felt the same unsettling presence in the air, the invisible weight of someone deciding how close to her cabin they dared to step. By midday, she gathered the small pieces of her routine: water from the barrel, firewood from the stack, flour sifted into a bowl. Movements she forced herself to complete, because doing nothing felt like surrender. Every step reminded her that her husband had once done these chores with effortless strength, and now the silence around her felt far older than widowhood. As she carried the firewood inside, she paused at the sound of distant hoofbeats. Slow, heavy, riding with purpose, not wandering. She set the logs down and stood at the doorway, heart climbing into her throat. The rider emerged from the bend in the road, horse broad, shouldered, head lowered against the cold. The man riding it held himself with the same stillness she remembered from the ridge. He stopped at her gate without dismounting. She could not see his full expression beneath the brim of his hat, but she caught the rigid line of his jaw, the way his shoulders shifted as if he weighed the risk of approaching her land again. She waited, fingers hooked lightly around the doorframe, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin. At last he spoke. His voice carried across the frosted yard, deep and guarded, but not unkind. Ma'am, I reckon you noticed someone walked up on your place last night. Her stomach tightened. The certainty in his tone told her what she needed to know. He'd been the one near her door, the one who stepped inside her cabin. But he hadn't come with threats, and he hadn't taken anything. He'd left only a single footprint, as though testing the border between his world and hers. She stepped forward, though her pulse quickened. Was it you? He lifted his chin slightly, enough to show he wasn't ashamed to answer. Yes, ma'am, but I didn't come to cause trouble. His gaze moved slowly across her yard, reading the lay of the land, noticing more than she wished he could. I was Mackin, sure no one else already had. A faint shiver passed through her, not from the cold. She studied him closely now, the worn coat, the dust on his boots, the way he sat his horse, like a man who'd lived more on the road than under any roof. There was danger in him, she could feel it, but there was also restraint. A man who held his violence the way others held secrets. The horse shifted beneath him, snorting into the cold air. He leaned forward and opened the gate with one gloved hand, moving slow enough for her to object if she wished. She didn't. Still, she stepped back as he guided the horse through and stopped a few yards from her porch. He dismounted, boots settling in the frost with a heavy finality. For the first time, she saw his face in full, the tired lines beneath his eyes, the fading bruise on his cheek, the stubble shadowing a jaw set against too many long nights. He looked like a man carrying debts that were not all his own. I'm passin' through, he said quietly. Storm's settin' in again. Thought I'd ask for shelter till morning. The familiarity of the request tightened something deep in her chest. Her husband had once offered strangers a place by the fire, believing kindness always came back home eventually. But the world felt sharper now, its rules rewritten by loss. Trust was no longer a habit, it was a gamble. She hesitated, her hand hovering near the door. Why come here? There's a town 3 miles east, a stable, a boarding room. He held her gaze with an honesty that felt heavier than the cold. Town don't want me, not the men running it anyway. He paused, something darker shifting behind his eyes. And you got riders circling your land. I figured you'd want someone awake enough to notice. Her breath caught. She hadn't told a soul about the hoofprints. She'd barely allowed herself to believe they were real. But he said it as if it were already known, already woven into the story of her danger. The wind changed, carrying the faint scent of snow. She looked toward the ridge where her husband's grave rested, then back to the stranger who stood waiting, not pushing, not pleading, only offering the truth of what he'd seen. She opened the door slowly. "Then you'd better come in before the storm gets worse." He nodded once, grateful but composed, as though accepting hospitality carried its own burden. He stepped inside, removing his hat with a quiet respect that surprised her. The warmth from the hearth brushed against his cold clothes, and for a moment they stood in the soft glow of the room, neither quite sure how close to stand or how far to stay. Outside, the sky darkened with the promise of snow. Inside, the fragile line between stranger and protector began to shift, though neither of them spoke it aloud. When she finally closed the door behind him, the latch clicked with a sound that felt too final for a man she had known for less than a day. Yet something about it eased a fraction of the fear she'd carried since the burial. By the time the storm settled over the valley, the cabin had taken on the quiet weight of two people learning how to breathe in the same space. The widow moved with careful purpose, setting out a small pot of coffee, though her hands trembled each time she brushed too near him. He stood near the hearth, warming the frost from his coat, watching the flames as if they carried pieces of memory he wished he could forget. She kept her distance, unsure whether he preferred silence or simply didn't know what to say. Every few moments, he glanced toward the window, reading the storm the way others read letters slowly, with a practiced eye. The tension between them wasn't hostile, merely unfamiliar, shaped by questions neither dared ask yet. By late afternoon, the snowfall thinned. Pale light filtered through the clouds and softened the edges of the world outside. He lifted his hat from the table, brushing frost from the brim, and turned toward her with a quiet firmness. "Before night falls, I want to look around your place, just to be sure those riders ain't close." Her breath caught. She wanted to say no, the instinct rose sharp and immediate. But fear had its own way of breaking old habits, and she nodded despite herself. He stepped out into the open yard with steady boots, leaving prints behind him like a trail of silent assurance. She watched from the porch, arms wrapped around her ribs, heartsick at how easy it was to rely on someone she barely knew. He crouched near the fence line, brushing snow aside with the back of his glove. She could tell by the stillness in his posture that he'd found something. When he finally stood, his face was unreadable, but his eyes held a deeper shadow than before. He walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, as if choosing each word carefully. "You weren't imagining things," he said. "Someone was circling your home, more than one." Her fingers tightened around her shawl, a cold shiver slipping beneath her skin. Why would anyone want to come here? Her voice was steady, but the question trembled in the space between them. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he traced his thumb along the frost gathering on the porch rail. Tracks look like men who ain't afraid of the cold, men ridden with a purpose. He paused, gaze steady on hers. Men who know what they're after. The fire inside her chest flickered with a mix of fear and anger. Her husband had died with secrets she still didn't understand, but she refused to believe his death had drawn danger to her door. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Whatever they're after, it isn't here." He looked at her gently, though sorrow darkened the line of his brow. Sometimes trouble ain't about what's here. Sometimes it's about what someone thinks is. His voice lowered, thick with unspoken history. And sometimes it follows a person long before they realize it's caught up. The wind shifted around them, carrying cold across the yard. She stepped back inside, the stranger following a moment later. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, as if the truth had taken a seat between them. She moved to the table and gripped the edge, grounding herself before she spoke again. If you know something, you should tell me." He exhaled slowly and set his hat down, the weight of it landing like a confession he wasn't ready to make. "I know the kind of men who leave tracks like that. I know how they think, and I know they don't ride out this far without a reason." His jaw tightened. "But I ain't sure yet if that reason is you." Her heart thudded once, hard and uneven. She looked at him, searching for lies and finding only tired honesty. A part of her wanted to send him away, to cling to the quiet life she'd tried to preserve. But another part, a deeper, older part, understood the truth. The world had changed the moment her husband died. Safety wasn't something she could pretend into existence. "That's why I'm stayin' through the storm," he said quietly. "And not 'cause I want trouble, but because you look like someone who's been carrying more than she should." The words softened something fragile inside her. She turned toward the window, watching snow gather along the edges of the glass. "I don't want to depend on anyone," she whispered. "Not again." He stepped back, giving her space, yet his voice stayed warm enough to reach her. "Ain't askin' you to depend on me, just askin' you to let me stand guard till morning." For a long moment, the only sound was the storm settling against the walls. She watched the faint outline of the ridge where her husband lay, the grave marked by the wooden cross she'd carved with her own hands. The presence of the stranger, steady, patient, felt like a counterweight to the emptiness she'd known since that day. As night draped itself across the valley, the cabin filled with a hush that felt less like fear and more like waiting. She lit a single lamp, and he moved to the window, resting a hand lightly on the frame, eyes scanning the dark. She sat at the edge of her bed, fingers curled loosely in her lap, trying to steady the ache that tightened her throat. The storm deepened, a low rumble echoing across the distant hills, and though neither of them spoke, a single truth settled quietly between them. The stranger wasn't leaving, not tonight. Not while danger pressed closer with every passing hour. The storm pressed hard against the cabin walls that evening, ice rattling the windows and wind sighing through the eaves. Inside, the hearth's fire stretched long shadows across the room, painting their faces with warmth and quiet tension. She moved carefully, setting a small pot to simmer, the faint hiss of water breaking the silence that had grown thick between them. He watched her, noting the tremor in her fingers, the way her wrist bent oddly when she lifted the spoon. His eyes lingered, though he did not speak. There was no judgment in his gaze, only recognition, a muted understanding that spoke of roads traveled and burdens carried. She shifted under it, folding her hands tightly over her lap, the bruise on her wrist a dull ache she hadn't shown anyone. By the time the coffee steamed and she placed 2 mugs on the table, the firelight seemed to pulse in quiet rhythm with their breaths. He picked up one, warm between his palms, and offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She sipped slowly, tasting the bitter comfort, wondering how a stranger could feel simultaneously threatening and protective. The cabin grew smaller with the storm outside, pressing them into a space neither wanted to fill completely. She glanced at him, noticing the lines beneath his eyes, the tension in his shoulders that suggested a life spent running, a past she could not yet name. "You've been on the road long," she said softly, not expecting an answer, merely speaking against the hush. He met her gaze steadily, holding it long enough to speak truth she could not ignore. Long enough to know some men don't forget old scores. He said. His voice carried weight, and in it, the faintest shadow of guilt. "Some debts aren't paid until someone stops running from 'em." Her hand unconsciously moved toward her own wrist, touching the bruise hidden beneath the shawl. "It's from them," she whispered, voice brittle. "The men my husband owed, or thought he owed, I don't know which." The words hung between them, fragile as a thread stretched across a canyon. He leaned back slightly, exhaling as if releasing a memory that had been coiled too tight. "I rode with men like that," He said quietly, almost to himself, "A long time ago, I left, but some part of me still remembers what it's like to be the one following orders that break a life." He looked at her then, eyes heavy, carrying both warning and honesty. "You shouldn't face them alone." The fire crackled again, and she felt a strange weight lift as he spoke, not relief, exactly, but the barest comfort that came from knowing someone else saw the danger as clearly as she did. She stared into the flames, tracing its shifting patterns, the heat touching her hands in a way that suggested warmth might still exist outside grief. By evening's end, the storm had thickened, snow piling against the cabin walls in quiet heaps. They sat across from each other in measured silence, sharing only the flicker of firelight and the heat of coffee mugs pressed between their palms. Words had been exchanged, truths hinted at, promises left unspoken, yet an understanding settled between them. The storm would not leave the cabin, and neither would he. As the fire burned low, she finally spoke, softer than she intended. "Why stay? You could leave anytime." He shrugged, gaze fixed on the flames. "Some debts are better paid by standing guard, not running from 'em. Yours, or his. I reckon I owe it anyway." Her breath caught. The line between danger and safety had blurred, leaving only the flicker of trust that was neither forced nor fragile. Outside, the wind groaned, but inside, the fire held them together. And in that quiet heat, a fragile promise took root. One neither of them spoke aloud, but both would honor come morning. By dawn, the snow had softened into a pale, endless white, and the cabin seemed smaller still, pressed between the storm and the ridge beyond. She moved quietly, carrying a folded paper clutched tightly in her hand. It had been tucked beneath the floorboard, hidden where no one could see it. Her husband had left it there for her, though she had only just found the courage to retrieve it. She unfolded the letter slowly, reading his familiar script with trembling hands. Each word carried the weight of the man she had loved, a mixture of fear, warning, and hope. The letter spoke of debts unpaid, of men who had grown restless in the weeks before his death, and of a plot that threatened not only her life, but the land she had inherited. Her chest tightened. She traced the lines with a finger, memorizing the way he had written, as if speaking directly to her. There was no room for doubt. This was not the rambling of grief or the paranoia of a man close to death. It was a precise map of danger, a lifeline she was only now uncovering. He watched her silently, leaning against the doorway, hands crossed loosely over his chest. There was an unspoken understanding in his gaze, the kind that made the room feel less empty. "I told you someone's been circling your land," he said softly. "This letter proves it's no accident." Her voice trembled as she replied, "He knew it was coming, and he left me this. He trusted me with it, even knowing I might be alone." She swallowed hard, folding the paper back into her hands. The thought of her husband's foresight, his concern, brought a bitter ache. He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "It wasn't just trust," he said quietly. "He asked me to make sure you're protected," said it himself. She looked up, startled, the folds of the letter heavy between them. You came because of him," she whispered, disbelief threading through her fear. He nodded, jaw tight, eyes shadowed. "When he knew the end was near, he made me swear I'd see you through this." The weight of his promise pressed against her chest in the quiet room. She realized then that he hadn't come as a stranger, but as someone bound by loyalty she could barely understand. The firelight flickered against the walls, the flames tracing their faces with soft warmth. She folded the letter carefully, placing it beside her on the table as though setting down a part of her grief. I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice quiet, unsure whether gratitude or fear came first. He shook his head slowly. "Ain't about thanks. It's about making sure you see morning. That's all." His eyes softened, though the shadows remained. There was honesty there, and an unspoken promise that the storm outside was not the only danger he had come to face. By evening, they sat in measured silence, the letter resting between them like a fragile bridge. She kept glancing at him, noting the careful steadiness in his posture, the way his gaze occasionally flicked to the ridge beyond. The storm had subsided enough to hear the wind, but the threat remained, close and invisible, and in that quiet, they both understood something neither would say aloud. The letter was more than a warning. It was a tether connecting her past, her loss, and the man who had arrived to carry her through it. The wind had shifted again by late afternoon, rattling the frost against the cabin windows like a quiet warning. Inside, the warmth from the fire offered little comfort, the shadows stretching long across the wooden floorboards. She moved carefully, gathering wood and stacking it with precise motions, her mind returning to the letter and the words she could no longer unsee. Danger, it seemed, had a persistence that no hearth could chase away. He watched her from across the room, arms crossed loosely, eyes scanning the faint ridge beyond. "You ought to have something ready," he said quietly, almost a suggestion, almost a warning. "Not just hope or firewood, something that'll make a man think twice." She looked at him sharply, refusing the implication. She had survived alone before. She could survive again. "You mean a gun?" she said, voice tight, brushing back a loose strand of hair. Her knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. "I won't carry one. Not while he's gone." The fire flickered between them, small shadows casting lines across her face, revealing the stubborn defiance that had kept her alive. He stepped closer, quiet but deliberate, his gaze never leaving hers. "This ain't stubbornness, ma'am. This is survival. And right now, survival doesn't care how brave or how proud you are." His words carried weight she could not ignore, yet she remained firm, rooted in grief and principle alike. By evening, a distant echo reached them, the sharp, unmistakable report of a gunshot across the valley. Both froze. She felt her stomach twist, and her hands gripped the table. The sound had been far, yet close enough to remind her that threats were no longer abstract, no longer distant. He moved to the door, boots quiet against the floor, and peered out into the falling snow, every line of his body taut and ready. "They're close," he said simply, returning to her side. "Closer than they ought to be." She drew in a shallow breath, her heart hammering with the realization that her refusal to arm herself might have consequences neither could fully predict. Fear pricked at her, sharp and immediate, though she refused to give it voice. The storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath alongside them. He leaned against the wall, shoulders stiff, and watched her, as if weighing what she might do next. "You can't face this alone," he said again, softer now, the edges of command softened by concern. "I can stay, but you need more than words if this comes to pass." She met his eyes, seeing not judgment, but an understanding that startled her. She had been alone so long she had forgotten how it felt to trust someone enough to accept help. And yet the thought of picking up a rifle, of taking part in a danger she had tried to ignore, filled her with both dread and a strange, hesitant clarity. Hours passed in measured silence, the fire crackling between them. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of wind against the roof, reminded her of the reality outside and inside. She realized that protection carried a cost, not only of trust, but of pride, fear, and the courage to allow someone else into the fragile edges of her life. By nightfall, snow had layered the earth outside, soft and blinding, masking footprints and hiding threats, yet the weight of danger remained unmistakable. She watched him as he settled near the window, hand resting lightly on the sill, eyes scanning the darkness. He had offered shelter, yet the quiet understanding between them carried the unspoken cost. Safety was never free, and in the lingering warmth of the cabin, with storm and threat pressing on all sides, she realized something she could not yet admit aloud. She would need him. Whether she liked it or not, survival had drawn the line, and she was already standing on the other side. Night fell hard over the cabin, thick and relentless, and the storm that had battered the valley earlier was replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against the walls. Outside, snow lay in drifts, masking every print and hollow, yet the tension inside the cabin thrummed like a living thing. She sat near the hearth, shoulders hunched, listening for the faintest sound of movement, every nerve alert to the possibility of danger. He paced slowly near the window, boots soft against the floorboards, eyes scanning the dark expanse beyond. "They'll be testing us soon," he said quietly, voice carrying just enough to reach her ears. She flinched, though she had expected it, knowing the men circling her property would not wait. Their presence was invisible but undeniable, lurking in the shadows like wolves smelling a wounded animal. By midnight, the quiet shattered with distant gunshots echoing through the valley. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as he moved toward her, steady and calm despite the chaos outside. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet his presence grounded her, a tether to survival she could neither explain nor resist. The first men appeared on the ridge, shapes against the snow, their intentions clear in the way they rode. He positioned himself between her and the threat, hand hovering near his holster, eyes narrowing with practiced focus. She noticed then the weight he carried, not just weapons, but the history of violence he had once served, the same violence that now stood between her and death. Bullets hissed through the air, and she dropped to the floor instinctively, heart hammering. He returned fire with measured precision, each shot deliberate, economical, controlled. The sound of gunfire filled the cabin, mixing with the howl of wind, yet he moved with a rhythm born of experience, a man who had long ago danced with danger and survived. When the echoes faded, the cabin was quiet again, save for their heavy breathing and the crackle of the fire. She rose slowly, hands shaking as she approached him. He looked worn, shadows of past scars beneath his eyes, yet there was a steadiness in the way he remained upright, alive, watching. "I should have told you," he said quietly, the words raw, "about what I've done, what I've been part of." She paused, noting the tremor in his voice, the weight behind it. "You don't have to," she whispered, understanding more than words could carry. But he spoke anyway, confessing the violence he had once embraced, the men he had ridden with, the debts paid in blood he had hoped never to revisit. Her gaze softened. She saw him now not as a stranger, not as a protector alone, but as a man worn by life, carrying guilt and regret in equal measure. She reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve, small and hesitant, a quiet acknowledgement that she understood and that forgiveness could begin in this fragile, firelit room. By the time dawn threatened the horizon with pale light, the storm of men and snow had passed, leaving only the hushed quiet of survival. She tended to the small injuries he had sustained, her hands gentle despite the tremor of adrenaline still in her veins. They moved in silent coordination, a fragile intimacy forged in the fire of danger, neither speaking of it aloud. The night had tested them, revealed truths and scars alike, and in its aftermath, she realized a subtle shift. Trust, though fragile, had begun to take root. The wolves had come close, but they had not taken her. He had stood between her and the darkness, and in doing so, left something of himself beside the hearth, where she could see it, and perhaps, in time, hold it. The morning light crept across the cabin floor, pale and hesitant, illuminating the quiet aftermath of the night's chaos. She moved slowly, tending to the small bruises and scratches he had gathered in the fight, her hands brushing against the roughness of his sleeve with delicate care. He did not flinch, did not pull away, but watched her with a stillness that made the air between them tremble with unspoken understanding. She paused as her fingers grazed a tender spot near his wrist, and without meaning to, her hand lingered. The touch was brief, a whisper of connection, yet it carried weight neither had anticipated. He looked down at her, the shadows of exhaustion and past regrets softening in his eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible tension eased, replaced by a fragile intimacy neither had dared allow before. The quiet cabin felt warmer, not from the fire alone, but from the presence of each other, cautious and deliberate. Words were unnecessary as they moved together in the small rituals of care, bandaging, washing, steadying. Every gesture spoke of trust, of acknowledgement that both had survived what they could not face alone. She began, stopping herself mid-sentence, the sound of her voice strange in the silence. He gave a small, patient nod, inviting her to continue, though he did not speak. Her hand tightened slightly, brushing against his forearm again, and the simple contact seemed to bridge months of grief and fear into a single, fragile moment of clarity. He shifted slightly, not interrupting, allowing her to feel the quiet steadiness that had become his presence. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," he said finally, voice low, almost reverent. She swallowed, nodding, realizing that the act of tending to him had allowed her own wound, the one left by loss, to ease, if only for a moment. Outside, the valley lay draped in the pale light of snow, the storm now a memory pressed against the distant ridge. Inside, they moved in tandem, small acts of care, weaving an unspoken bond. Each touch, each glance, each quiet breath began to dissolve the distance that had stood between them since the first morning he arrived. By evening, the shadows had deepened, and the room held a gentle hush that neither wanted to break. She set down the last of her ministrations, fingers brushing against his hand one final time. The contact lingered, deliberate, and he met her gaze, the faintest warmth tugging at the corners of his eyes. Neither spoke of it, yet both understood. The moment had shifted. She had touched him, and he had let her. In the fragile quiet that followed, it became clear that trust had taken its first real shape, not in words, not in promises, but in the simple acknowledgement of each other's presence, steady and real. Night draped the valley in a pale hush, and the cabin felt suspended between the world outside and the fragile quiet they had built within. She sat near the hearth, the last of the firelight flickering across her hands as she traced the edges of her shawl. The ache of solitude she had carried for weeks clung stubbornly, yet the presence of the gunslinger beside her made it feel almost bearable. He moved quietly, taking a seat near the window, the faint glow of moonlight catching the worn line of his jaw. For a long moment they shared no words, only the rhythm of breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. The tension between need and fear weighed heavily in the room, an unspoken truth neither dared voice. Her gaze drifted toward his hand, resting lightly on the windowsill, steady and unyielding. Something in her stirred, a fragile impulse that had no name, no permission. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out, letting her fingers brush against his coat sleeve. The contact was deliberate, searching, a silent question pressed against the boundaries of propriety and longing. He stiffened slightly, not in refusal, but in recognition of the line she dared cross. "You shouldn't," he began, voice low and wary, yet he did not pull away. His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching, reading her with a mixture of caution and understanding. The room seemed smaller suddenly, charged with something neither grief nor fear could contain. She drew in a shaky breath, sensing the precariousness of the moment. "I can't send you away," she whispered, almost to herself, almost a confession. "Not tonight, not when." Her words faltered, hanging between them like the snow-laden branches outside, delicate and weighted. He leaned back, maintaining distance, yet his presence pressed gently into her awareness. "I ain't leavin'," he said finally, voice measured, carrying a truth she could feel in her bones. "Not while it matters." It was not a promise of love, not yet, but a pledge of protection, a recognition of their intertwined fates. The firelight shifted, and shadows danced across the cabin walls, a quiet reminder of the vulnerability they shared. She withdrew her hand slowly, though the tremor in her fingers spoke of more than restraint. She had crossed the line between need and want, and he had not stopped her. That small acknowledgment was a quiet victory, a beginning neither had named aloud. By the early hours, silence settled over them again, soft and deliberate. She curled against the edge of the hearth, letting herself breathe in the warmth, letting herself accept that she was no longer entirely alone. He remained near the window, eyes scanning the darkened valley, yet every so often, a glance met hers fleeting, but heavy with unspoken truth. The sun had barely risen over the ridge when a rider appeared on the horizon, cutting a rigid line against the pale sky. She saw him first, long before he reached the gate, a man mounted on a black horse, shoulders squared and eyes sharp as flint. The way he carried himself spoke of authority, menace, and the certainty of ownership over all he surveyed. Her stomach tightened. She recognized the hard edges of the cattle baron's figure from town gossip, from whispered warnings she had ignored until now. And yet, seeing him approach so deliberately, she understood the gravity of the words left unspoken in the letter, the weight of debts that were not just numbers but lives. He rode straight to the cabin, not slowing until he stood a mere yard from the gate. The gunslinger stepped out first, placing himself between her and the threat, the tension in his stance quiet yet unmistakable. She clenched her hands, suddenly aware of the fragile barrier they had created against the world, a barrier that now trembled under the weight of confrontation. "You owe me," the man said, voice smooth and unyielding, carrying the authority of wealth and the cruelty of entitlement. His eyes flicked to the gunslinger, recognition flashing in that same calculating glance. "And I see you've chosen the wrong side." Her pulse quickened, a storm of fear and defiance rising in equal measure. "I owe nothing," she said, voice tight, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. The letter had warned her, the gunshots had prepared her, but the presence of this man, so deliberate in his threat, made all prior danger feel pale by comparison. He dismounted with deliberate slowness, boots thudding against the frost-hardened ground. "You think words or fire can shield you from what's coming?" he asked, eyes narrowing. The gunslinger moved slightly forward, hands hovering near his holster, but she could see the restraint in his posture, controlled, measured, protective. "Leave her out of this," the gunslinger said, voice low and steady, the weight of past lives and debts carried in every syllable. "This isn't her fight alone, and I won't let it be." His words were not a challenge, not a threat, but a promise, silent and heavy with conviction. The Baron laughed softly, a sound that cut through the morning air like steel on stone. "You stand in my way," he sneered. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I've taken from men like you before?" His gaze lingered on the gunslinger, measuring, assessing, weighing past enmities against the present risk. She stepped forward then, heart pounding, refusing to shrink beneath the intimidation. "You won't take me," she said quietly, but with the force of all she had endured. Her hand brushed against the doorframe, steadying herself, yet the determination in her tone left no room for doubt. The menacing calm of the Baron faltered, if only for a heartbeat. The gunslinger's gaze met hers, silent acknowledgment passing between them. He had come to protect her, and she had begun to understand that survival now required trust, courage, and the quiet defiance she had once thought impossible. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest whisper of snow across the valley, a reminder that danger still pressed close. The valley was cold, pale light spilling over the snow-laden ridges as they fled across the fields, leaving the cabin behind. Hooves cut through the frost, carrying them toward higher ground, every heartbeat loud in the hollow quiet of the morning. She clutched her shawl, feeling the raw edge of fear pressed against her ribs, and for the first time, fully aware that danger had not merely knocked at her door, it had chased her out into the open. He rode beside her, steady and unflinching, though every line in his face carried the weight of the violence he had survived and the cost it demanded. The Baron's men trailed them, persistent and calculating, their shadows long across the snow. With each distant shot, she felt the brush of mortality, the sharp reminder that trust and reliance carried their own price. They reached the fence line, the boundary of her husband's land, and paused in a frozen hollow, breaths steaming in the cold. Blood had marked the ground, hers or theirs. She could not tell, and the smell of iron in the air made her stomach churn. He surveyed the field, eyes narrowing, instincts taut and ready. "They're cuttin' closer," he murmured. "And they don't leave witnesses." She swallowed hard, gripping the reins with trembling hands. I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, voice barely more than a whisper. But he did not falter. His presence was a solid anchor, a weight she could cling to in a world that had become suddenly crueler than she'd imagined. Gunfire erupted again, breaking the cold silence like a thunderclap. He dismounted quickly, moving between her and the first wave of attackers with fluid precision. Her heart hammered, terror biting at her mind, yet something within her steadied a recognition that he was more than skill, more than weaponry. He was a man willing to endure the cost so she could live. By the time the last of the men fell back, the valley was quiet once more, though the marks of battle remained stark across the fence line. She dismounted, legs trembling, and stepped into the snow, streaked ground, seeing the gunslinger's hands bloodied, eyes heavy with exhaustion but resolute. "You kept me alive," she said softly, though words felt too small for the gratitude she carried. He shook his head slowly, almost in dismissal, but there was truth in his quiet reply. "Didn't do it for thanks," he said. "Did it 'cause it had to be done." And yet she could see in his eyes the cost, the weight of every life he had taken, every choice forced by a past that never truly let him go. By nightfall, they found a hidden hollow, sheltering them from the snow and the eyes that might still watch. She tended to the cuts along his arm, hands careful, each touch deliberate. A fragile silence grew between them, heavier than any storm, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of survival and reliance. They found refuge in an abandoned line shack, the wind howling outside like a distant warning. Inside, the small space smelled of dust and old wood, yet the shelter was enough to hold them for the night. She moved quietly, tending to his shoulder where a shallow cut had begun to stiffen with cold, her hands brushing the rough fabric of his coat with careful attention. He watched her with an intensity that was new, softening only when her fingers traced the line of his wound. "I never thought I'd stop running," he said quietly, voice low against the hum of the wind. "Not for a place, not for a person. Certainly not for someone I didn't know." His eyes, however, betrayed the truth. The weight of emotion he had never expected was pressing against him, fragile and frightening. She stayed near him, moving as though her presence alone could ease the tension he carried. "You don't have to explain it," she whispered, aware of the tremor in her voice. Yet he did, compelled by the quiet trust in her gaze. "I rode with men who left nothing but ruin behind. I thought I'd always carry that ruin with me, that it would define the rest of my life." Her hand lingered near his, a small, unspoken gesture of forgiveness and understanding. The warmth of contact, even fleeting, brought a tremor to both their hearts. "You're not that man anymore," she said softly, voice steady despite the storm that still raged outside. "You chose to come here. You chose to protect me. That matters." He exhaled slowly, eyes closing for a brief moment, as if letting a burden settle. "I never meant to feel like this," he admitted, the words almost foreign to him. "I never meant to care about someone in a way that would keep me here, waiting, risking everything." Her fingers brushed his arm again, a silent promise that his fears were shared, softened by her own courage. The shack, small and dim, became a sanctuary not from the storm outside, but from the storms within their hearts. They sat in quiet companionship, words giving way to presence, each learning that survival and care could coexist. She realized she was beginning to forgive herself for past choices, for the moments she had felt powerless, for the grief she had carried alone. By dawn, the light seeped through the cracks in the walls, pale but insistent. He remained seated near the door, gaze lingering on her profile, and she understood that his heart had shifted in ways neither had anticipated. The night had revealed a vulnerability he had long resisted, and she had seen it, held it, without judgment. The morning air bit cold against their faces as they crested the ridge, the valley stretching below in pale light. The gunslinger's eyes scanned every movement, every shadow, yet she noticed a tension in his shoulders she had not seen before, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Danger was no longer distant. It had come to claim him, to test the limits of their fragile alliance. He dismounted first, glancing at her with a warning she could feel in her bones. "Stay back," he said softly, voice low but resolute. She wanted to argue, to stand by his side, but instinct and fear tethered her to the ridge, a quiet line of safety she could not cross. The cattle baron's men had cornered them, a silent ring of inevitability tightening around the hollow. He faced them jaw tight, eyes shadowed with history and regret, yet unflinching. She watched as he measured the distance, the angle, every movement precise, not a single motion wasted, not a single choice careless. He raised his hands, surrender appearing in the curve of his shoulders, though she could see in his gaze the calculation beneath, the understanding that the only way to protect her was to bear the full weight of consequence alone. Her chest constricted. She realized then that the price of standing still was more than fear. It was sacrifice, the hard, undeniable truth that love and protection sometimes demanded separation. "You can't do this," she whispered, voice trembling. He shook his head, eyes meeting hers with a quiet gravity. "I have to," he said. "If I don't, they'll come for you, not just me. This ends with me, or it doesn't end at all." She wanted to protest, to fight the inevitability, but words failed her. All she could do was watch as he approached the men, every step measured, every heartbeat deliberate. The air was heavy with silence, snow crunching beneath boots, each moment stretching like an eternity between trust and danger. When he finally reached the men, surrender was complete. He mounted their words with quiet defiance, eyes never leaving hers, letting her know in ways unspoken that his choice was not weakness, but courage. She felt her heart shatter and swell all at once, knowing she had relied on him, and that reliance demanded a price she could barely bear to witness. By nightfall, the ridge was empty, save for the faint echoes of hooves and the fading cold of the valley. She stood alone, watching the trail of dust and snow that marked his passage, a silent witness to the sacrifice he had chosen to protect her. The line between life and loss had been drawn, and she understood the depth of his devotion, a debt paid not in words, but in courage and chains. The town lay quiet beneath a gray, unforgiving sky, its streets dusted with frost and whispered rumors. She moved with purpose, boots crunching against the hard earth, the rifle balanced firmly in her hands. It was not an ornament, nor a token of fear. It was a statement, a claim of agency she had never dared to assert before. People paused as she passed, eyes wide with disbelief and whispered speculation. The widow, long thought fragile and alone, now carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced death and returned. The weapon in her hands was not just protection. It was the measure of her resolve, the echo of every night spent waiting, surviving, and understanding the cost of passivity. She made her way to the sheriff's office first, the weight of her purpose pressing with every step. His eyes widened just slightly when he saw the rifle. He had known her as someone to pity, someone who would yield to the town's expectations. Now he saw the truth. She was no longer a woman to be dismissed or protected. She was a force determined to reclaim the life that had been threatened. Next, she moved to the bank, where ledgers and cold calculations had once dictated the limits of her freedom. She met the banker's gaze, unflinching, and let the rifle rest lightly across her shoulder. Words were unnecessary. The gesture alone carried history, warning, and the clarity of one who had survived more than grief alone. The Baron's men noticed her in the streets, whispers rushing like wind through dry grass. They recognized the change, the shift from widow to presence, from victim to someone capable of consequence. She walked calmly, deliberately, knowing every glance, every whisper, reinforced the power of her resolve. Finally, she approached the jail, where he was held, chains binding the man who had once risked everything to keep her alive. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of determination. The rifle remained steady in her hands, a bridge between action and intention, justice and love. The sheriff met her at the door, his authority balanced with hesitation. She did not flinch, did not bow to the judgment in his eyes. "Release him," she said, voice unwavering, the words carrying the authority of someone who had faced loss, danger, and moral reckoning. Every inch of doubt in the room faltered under the force of her presence. By evening, she had returned to the empty streets, the echoes of her footsteps a quiet testament to change. The rifle was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol, a reclamation of her life, and a declaration that the man who had protected her would not be left to bear the cost alone. The jail smelled of cold stone and iron, the air thick with the weight of confinement and unspoken regrets. She approached the barred window where he sat, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed but alive. Words failed her for a moment, overwhelmed by the emotion she had carried through the storm, the chase, and the nights of quiet intimacy. He looked up when she arrived, and in that instant, the distance created by chains seemed inconsequential. Her presence, steady and resolute, spoke louder than any plea, louder than any threat or threat of violence. He had fought to protect her, to shield her from a world that would take everything without question, and now she was here, finally, to honor that sacrifice. Her fingers rested lightly on the cold metal of the bars, bridging the divide with touch and intent. "I found it," she said quietly, holding a folded piece of evidence proof that the Baron had orchestrated her husband's death. The paper trembled in her hand, but her resolve did not. Justice, long delayed, had finally found a path to her door. He studied her, eyes dark and reflective, absorbing both the proof and the emotion she carried. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," he said softly, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the hardened line of his jaw. She shook her head, a faint smile brushing her lips. "I couldn't wait, not for anyone, not for you. You deserve this." The town had begun to stir outside, whispers rippling like wind through dry grass. The Baron's power was not absolute. The truth had shifted the scales. She and the gunslinger shared a quiet glance, the acknowledgement of battles fought both within and without. The chains would not define him, nor would the threat that had pursued them. She slipped the evidence to the sheriff, watching as the man's expression changed from skepticism to understanding. The weight of law, of authority, and the town's collective conscience leaned toward what was right, finally. He would be released, not just because of proof, but because she had taken her stand, a widow claiming justice with clarity and courage. When the bars opened and he stepped out, the world felt different, smaller, safer, warmer. Neither spoke immediately, the magnitude of what had been achieved settling quietly between them. His gaze found hers, gratitude, and something deeper reflecting in the depths of his eyes, a mirror to the bond that had grown through fire, snow, and fear. The sky darkened once more, heavy clouds rolling across the valley like a tide of wrath. The Baron, enraged by the exposure of his deeds, mounted his horse with a fury that promised blood. She gripped her rifle, every nerve taut, while the gunslinger stood beside her, eyes narrowing, muscles coiled like a spring. The calm before the storm was gone. The storm itself had arrived. They rode into the open, the clash inevitable, the valley echoing with the distant thunder of hooves. Bullets cut through the air, sharp and unforgiving, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between her, him, and the man who had once sought to destroy them. She moved with precision, each shot measured, each breath deliberate, heart sinking with the rhythm of survival and courage. He fought with the quiet intensity of a man who knew the stakes were life and death, not only for him, but for her. Every maneuver was deliberate, every decision tempered by experience and the unspoken weight of responsibility. She watched, learning in real time the cost of protection, the depth of devotion it demanded. The Baron faltered, his arrogance giving way to desperation, and she saw the vulnerability beneath the menace. The gunslinger moved with deliberate steps, positioning, waiting, ensuring that her safety remained absolute even in the chaos. She fired again, not out of fear, but with purpose, the world narrowing to the clarity of action and consequence. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside, wind and snow whipping against them, as if the land itself bore witness. The Baron's final charge ended abruptly, the violence ceasing as swiftly as it had begun. She lowered the rifle, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had led to this moment: loss, grief, trust, and survival. He reached for her then, hand brushing hers, grounding her in the aftermath. Neither spoke immediately, the quiet between them a recognition of the ordeal they had endured together. The valley was silent again, save for their breathing and the faint whisper of snow over bloodied ground. By nightfall the storm had passed, leaving the land and their hearts cleansed, if only slightly. She stood beside him, watching the darkness recede, understanding that the battle had been more than physical. It had been a trial of courage, of choice, and of love. The first light of dawn stretched across the valley, soft and pale, brushing the edges of the cabin with gentle clarity. She stepped outside, the cold biting her cheeks, and inhaled deeply, savoring the quiet that had followed the storm. For the first time in weeks, the world felt almost at peace, and the weight of fear and grief she had carried seemed to lift, if only slightly. He appeared beside her, his boots crunching softly on the frost, hardened earth. The cabin, once a place of loss and memories of her husband, now felt different, warmer, steadier, safer. She watched him, noting the ease in his posture, the small moments of life returning to a man long burdened by past violence. "I thought I'd lost it all," she said quietly, voice barely rising above the breeze, "but maybe not." He glanced at her, eyes shadowed but brightened with faint relief, a flicker of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His hand hovered near hers, then gently found it, fingers curling around hers with the assurance of presence. They walked toward the cabin together, careful and deliberate, savoring the soft golden light spilling through the frost-laced windows. Inside, the fire glimmered faintly, waiting to be fed, a symbol of warmth and renewal. Each movement carried weight, each glance acknowledgment of all they had endured: the danger, the chase, the nights spent in quiet confessions and shared vulnerability. He paused at the door, boots steady, coat dusted with frost. She turned to him, heart pounding, eyes meeting his with a depth of unspoken emotion. For a moment he seemed ready to leave, as if the past and the world beyond demanded his return. But she stepped closer, breath shallow, and whispered the words that had first called him to her door. "Please, stay." The simplicity of the plea held more power than any battle, any struggle, any storm they had faced. He looked at her then, fully, the shadows of doubt and guilt receding, replaced by a quiet certainty. In that moment, the past, the danger, and the fear all fell away, leaving only the fragile, luminous space between them. By mid-morning, the cabin felt like home for the first time in years. The valley was calm, the snow glinting softly, and the two of them moved within that peace with tentative ease. Each glance, each touch, was a promise of presence, of protection, and of hearts learning the contours of trust and hope. The rebuilt cabin glowed softly in the late afternoon, a sanctuary from all the storms they had endured. She moved between the hearth and the window, hands still trembling slightly from the weight of everything they had survived. Outside, the valley stretched quiet and endless, the snow glinting in pale light, a mirror to the fragile peace that had finally settled over them. He leaned against the doorframe, boots dusted from the trail, eyes lingering on her with an intensity that made the air between them taut and electric. She could see the man he had been, hardened, burdened, haunted, but now softened, transformed by trust, survival, and the quiet shaping of shared lives. Every glance carried unspoken acknowledgement, every small motion a testament to the bond forged in danger and tender care. "I was going to leave," he said, voice low, as if afraid to shatter the moment, but his words trailed heavy with uncertainty and emotion. She stepped closer, heart pounding, and placed her hand lightly on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "But you don't have to," she whispered, voice trembling yet clear. "Stay with me." He studied her, shadows of past regrets flickering across his face before dissolving into warmth. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to kneel by the fire, letting the weight of his choice settle into the room like a promise kept. No duty, no obligation, no guilt, only the decision to remain, to claim what had been quietly offered through nights of danger, quiet confessions, and mutual understanding. She reached for him, hand brushing his cheek, feeling the scarred edges of the man she had come to trust, admire, and, in time, love. The silence stretched, soft and reverent, broken only by the crackle of the fire. In that fragile hush, they understood. They had survived the storms, both outside and within, and now they could finally exist in the quiet glow of choice, presence, and unspoken devotion. The day waned, light fading into amber and shadow, but neither moved. He stayed, she stayed, and in the warmth of the rebuilt hearth, the darkness that had haunted them was held at bay.